Hey, and while people are tuning in right now, we're starting this new series, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And I'm addicted. I'm addicted to this guy, really. I'm addicted to him. And I hope you will be too as we play some clips and do some things through this series. Probably 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks we'll see. But welcome to all of those who are watching on the internet. Glad that you're here and glad that you're a part of this. It's been over 50 years since his program, the Neighborhood program, started airing on PBS. He had some other little programs prior to that, but the one that was famous, over 50 years. The first episode was in 1968, and the last one was in August of 2001, 33 years span of this TV program for children. And as I have researched this man and his legacy, I'm not sure I've ever heard of a nicer, more respected, genuinely good human being as Fred Rogers. His reputation is sterling, and everything about his offstage life is mirrored here in his in-stage persona, or on-stage persona. I mean, to this day, after all these years, there's not a blemish on his record, not a skeleton in his closet. People who knew him, his family, say the same things about him as the little children that had the good fortune to grow up with him. Interestingly enough, he was an ordained minister. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister, and that's what he decided his calling in life was going to be. And then he decided he was going to lay that aside, and he went to his dad and said, I'm not going to be a minister right now. I want to go into TV. And his dad's response was, "You don't even know what TV is." You know, this is you got to understand when this was. This is way back when TV was just beginning, just starting. And but he was a minister, and though he never preached from a traditional pulpit, he preached with his life. And his message was very simple, just like the message of Jesus. Love and compassion for every person you meet, just the way they are. And oftentimes he would have guests on his show that had various, for instance, physical handicaps or life situations that were different than what the society at that time was calling normal. And he preached this message over and over again. Every person needs to be loved. Every person deserves compassion just the way they are. That sounds like what we preach, right? It sounds like what we teach through the ministry of grace. Because people of all races, all abilities, all beliefs, all backgrounds are all equal in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Wouldn't it be great if our world was a neighborhood like that? and everybody was neighbor. By neighbor, he means friend that he likes, and he wants you to be his neighbor, a friend that you like him as well. Wouldn't it be cool if that's the way society was? In fact, oftentimes he would tell the children on the program, "There is no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just as you are." That was a cool thing for him to say, and those children just loved it. So let's do this. For the next few weeks, let's explore what it means to like people that way, just as they are. What it means to see people as neighbors, as friends, and love them as they are, but also where they are in life. Now we're going to begin this exploration in Luke chapter 10. If you want to turn your Bible there, if you have it with you. It's a really well-known story. It's called the story of the Good Samaritan. You're familiar with that, aren't you? Let me read a few verses and then say a few things about the story, and then we'll jump in for a few lessons, okay? In Luke chapter 10, verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" And he answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he, this lawyer, wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Now, if your Bible's anything like me, right above that passage, it probably has a heading that says the Good Samaritan. Does your Bible do that? Does it say the Good Samaritan? But even if you've never read this story, never heard this story, we're all familiar with the term Good Samaritan, right? We use that even in our modern day culture. It means a nice guy, a nice woman, right? It means a helper, one you can count on in time of need, one that makes the world just a little bit better place, right? Well, in Jesus' day, there was no such thing as a Good Samaritan. Look over here, look back here. In Jesus' day, there was no such thing as a Good Samaritan. All right? That's something that we came up with. In fact, this story is one of the most controversial stories in the entire Bible. For instance, this lawyer was not like a lawyer that we think of today. This was a religious lawyer. This was a guy whose jurisdiction was over God's laws, over the Torah. It was all those don't eat this, eat that, wear this, don't wear that, do this, don't do that kind of thing. And in this context here, he was listening to Jesus, trying to find fault with what Jesus was saying so that he might condemn Jesus with the law. After all, Jesus was creating quite a ruckus at this time. He was preaching about this new kingdom. He's referring to God as his dad. He's healing people who were sick. He was forgiving sins, not pointing out sins like the lawyer did. He was forgiving sins. So these lawyers, these religious experts, they would follow Jesus around and they would try to trap him. And one of the ways they did that is they were very intellectual, and one of the ways they did that, they would lob these loaded questions at him, hoping that hoping they could trick him in front of his followers to giving an answer that was illegal. You've all been asked loaded questions, haven't you? You remember those kind of times, right? A question with an underlying meaning to it, like if your wife asks, "Honey, does this dress make me look fat?" That's a loaded question. Or, "Do you like my cooking better than my mom's?" I'm going to tell you guys something. You young married guys, if that ever happens, you run out of the house as fast as you can, and you get in your car and you start driving, and you just keep on driving. You don't even mess around with that kind of thing. So actually, what Jesus, what this lawyer should, and that's what he should have done. He should have got out of there, because he asked Jesus this loaded question about, of all things, he's asking him about the law. Now think about this. Really? He's asking Jesus about the law. Jesus is God. God wrote the law. Hello? Jesus wrote the law. He knew what the law, you got to be kidding. It's going to be pretty tough to trick the author of the law with that which he authored. How can you do that? So Jesus responds to him, and it stumps the lawyer. And it kind of scares him, actually, because he knows he's asking the law. He asked a question that the lawyer couldn't answer. So the lawyer tries to take the spotlight off of himself, and he responds with a question. He said, well, Lord, who is my neighbor? Okay, who is my neighbor? Which, by the way, that was a rhetorical question, because in Jewish understanding, neighbor was simply another Jew. That's what neighbor meant in this context. Now watch how Jesus bursts this guy's bubble in verse 30. In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan," and I suspect he paused for effect right there, "but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him, and he went to him and bandaged his wounds, poured on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey and brought him to an inn to take care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave to the innkeeper 2 coins. And he said to the innkeeper, 'Look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any added expense that you may have.' And then Jesus asked the question, 'Which of these 3 do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?' And the expert in the law replied, 'The only way he could. Well, the one who had mercy on him.'" So Jesus is talking to a Jewish audience, and he says there's a Jewish man coming from Jerusalem and heading to Jericho. And in the days before the police before police forces and before security cameras. He's beaten, he's robbed, and left for dead. And notice verse 30, he just simply said a man. He doesn't specify who it was. And I think that's purposeful because this man is representative of so many then and even now who live in the midst of suffering and live in the midst of pain and hardship. People we see often, people that you run into and will this week, that outwardly look like everything's A-okay, but inwardly they are hurting desperately. And if you had some sort of lengthy conversation, that hurt would probably come out. You've been around. You understand how true that is, right? Marriages hanging by a thread, kids who've been abused verbally and emotionally and physically, parents with wayward children, family members who've lost loved ones, financial crises, those kinds of things. So here's a man bloody and beaten, and enter the picture two other men, churchmen, if you'll call them, a priest and a Levite. One was the one who performed the rituals. The other one was the Levite who did the music. So you got a pastor and a song leader, right? You got Michael and Derek, kind of. Well, we're not like them, right? We're not like these guys, but that kind of deal. I call them the religious on your outline, okay? Over the centuries, there's been a lot of creative explanations about why these men passed by. They were religious men, after all. Why would they do that? Why would they pass by? Some people say, well, the guy was beaten, he was half dead. This was a traditional place for robbers, this particular passage, and so maybe they were just fearing for their own life and thought the guy would die anyway. So out of self-preservation, they just kept going. Others have said, well, they were Jewish leaders, and if they'd gotten into this guy's mess, they would become unclean, and they didn't want to do that because they were on their way to the temple to perform the ceremonies. Other people say, well, obviously they were just heartless. They're just a couple of jerks. That's why they didn't stop there. That's probably closer to the truth, really, but the truth is we don't actually know because Jesus did not explain their motivation. All he explained was their actions. But I got to thinking, if the story happened today, wonder what we would come up with why these two guys, if we were watching the story and we had to guess why those two men passed by without helping, I wonder what we might say. Here's what I came up with. The first thing we might say is they were just caught up in the rat race. I'm thinking of our culture in particular. Everything's in a hurry. And it might have been for them too. In a hurry. They have a schedule to keep. No time for anyone else or any other thing. Except what's on the smartphone or the iPad, right? In fact, I know people, and I've been in this situation, people who really have a good heart and good intentions, but they become so stressed with responsibilities, they just don't have time and emotional energy to expend on anyone or anything. Have you been there before in your life? You go through seasons like that. I think we all do. In the past 20 years, I read an article that said Americans' work week has jumped from 41 hours to over 50 hours per week. For people in management, that's increased to over 60 hours per week on the average. And leisure time has decreased at the same time 40%. Now think about that. Think about the stress that's engendered by those kind of statistics. You add to that pressure that families have today of two-career families or the incredible pressures of a single parent or blended family, and the result is that there are many people that you come in contact with each week, and they are living in crisis mode 24/7. I mean, it's just a continual crisis. So yes, it's easy to get to the place where the busyness of life causes us to miss ministry opportunities. We'll all go through those seasons. But the second thing I'm thinking about is maybe they were just calloused to the needs of other people. Now think about this. Do you remember that story about the rich man and Lazarus? It's found in Luke chapter 16. I want to read you a few verses from that story that kind of illustrates this point. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen. That means this guy was cool. He had the latest threads, right? He just came back from New York City Fashion Week, and he was decked. He lived in luxury every day, and at his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. He didn't want the stuff on the table anymore. He was at the point now, if there was a crumb that fell, that's good enough for me. The rich man, or the time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side, which was their vision of heaven. And the rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, the rich man looked up and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, now watch this, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received the good things, while Lazarus received the bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Here's the deal. The rich man had become so calloused to the beggar. He had stepped over him so many times. He refused to minister to him so long that he finally came to the place where he didn't even see the need anymore. Do you suppose that can happen to us? Do you suppose that we could become this kind of a person, at least through seasons, if we're not careful? We can. The other day we went to the grocery store, and after our cycling class, we went to the grocery store and just hurried in real quick and hurried out. And I was pushing the cart as we came out, and we got to the car, unloaded everything, got in, and as I was backing out, Nancy asked me a question. She said, did you see that homeless man? And I said, no. Where was he? She did. He was sitting up there not far from the door. She said, I think he's has mental illness as well. I said, no, I didn't see him. And she was going through her purse, and she said, I got to have this, and she was looking for money. I said, baby, I have no cash on me. I've got a credit card. I said, there's an ATM. So she said, no. And I said, okay, let me pull around. And so she took all the money she had. We pulled around. She got out and went and gave it to the man. And I thought about it later. She saw him immediately when she came out. I didn't even see him. I walked right by him. It's not because I have a bad heart. It's not because I would intentionally ever do that, ever. It's just because evidently I was in that state where people's needs didn't matter to me at that particular time. Does that make sense at all? I'm not beating myself up over it. That happens from time to time for all of us. I get that. Here's what I understand about God. God sees to it that there are plenty of Lazaruses in our life every single day. Think about that. So let's be careful not to become so callous that we no longer see the need. And people would argue, you know, I know I would have someone argue with me, say, well, a person like that, all those troubles, they're just facing the consequences of their action. It's their own fault. They're just kind of reaping what they sow. If they'd stop doing drugs and stop abusing alcohol, stop selling their body, if they just stayed in school, if they just made good choices, then this wouldn't be a problem for them. I mean, I work hard and I make good choices. That's why I'm where I am. So why should I step in and help someone get out of circumstances caused by their own bad decisions? You've heard things said like that, right? I hear them all the time. Here's the truth. Yes, there are undeniable consequences from bad decisions, from drug use, from infidelity, from laziness, whatever. But here's the problem with looking at people through that particular lens. Because did Jesus maybe step in and maybe help us when we made some poor choices in life, when we sinned? Sure he did, absolutely. In fact, that's why he showed up on the planet in the first place, because of the poor choices that began with Adam and Eve and continue right into our generation, got us all in a world of hurt that we could never get out of on our own. So now does that mean that I go and just enable people? No. Do we teach them life skills and help them and show them a better way? Absolutely. But the consequences to poor choices do not disqualify us from reaching out a hand of compassion to anyone at any time, whatever their need is. Doesn't disqualify that. All right, let's move on. That's the negative side of this story. Let me talk to you about this positive. I call this man the righteous. Those guys were the what do I call them? Yeah, the religious. Okay, this is the righteous. In Luke chapter 10, verse 33. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, poured on oil and wine, and then put the man on his own donkey and brought him to the inn, took care of him. He told the innkeeper later, he said, you know, I'll be back through this way next week. If you've got any more expenses, I'll be happy to pay them. Now, this is really striking, especially in light of that culture at the time, because the Samaritans and the Jews, I think we've talked about this a couple of times, Samaritans and Jews hated each other. The Samaritans were a culture that emerged when Jewish people started marrying and reproducing with non-Jewish religions and non-Jewish people. So to the Jews, especially the religious Jews, Samaritans were viewed as a mixed race, as they were known as half-breeds. They were the lowest of the low. They were despised and hated by most Jewish people. In fact, if Jews had to travel somewhere and they had to go through Samaria, they would go way around for weeks and weeks and weeks just so they did not have to go through Samaria. It would be like this today. It would be like, you know that person that you really don't care for? That person just kind of gets under your skin, kind of just rubs you the wrong way, irritates you to no. Does anyone have anyone that just irritates them to no end? People you can't stand being around. You want to run the other way when you see them coming. Jesus makes that person the hero of this story. That's who the hero of this story is. It would be like, so if you're a Florida State Seminole fan, Jesus is telling the parable of the good Florida Gator. If you're a Gator fan, he's telling the parable of the good Florida State Seminole. Or maybe on a more serious note, it would be like Jesus telling the parable of the good Democrat if you're a Republican, or the good Republican if you're a Democrat, or the parable of a good strip club owner, or the parable of the gay rights activist, or the parable of the anti-gay right activist, the parable of the pro-choice politician, or the parable of the pro-life politician. But here's the deal with the story. Jesus doesn't qualify who the Samaritan is. He doesn't say, yes, this is a Samaritan, but you got to understand, he's one of the good ones. He doesn't even do that. All Jesus said was this was a Samaritan. So Jesus is looking at this religious lawyer, and he's saying, I know you think you're all that. I know you think you're pretty awesome. And I know you think that because you obey all these rules that you're in. So let me tell you a story about a guy that you hate, the lowest of the low, and teach you something about compassion. Now Jesus is throwing shade at the lawyer. You get that? You feel the sting here? Feel the burn that's going on here? Notice how the Samaritan responded to this guy that was injured. First of all, number one, put this down in your outline, he stopped. That was a big deal. The other people just kept on walking, it says. He stopped. He paused his journey to tend to this bleeding man. Even though he was putting his own life in jeopardy from robbers who still might be close by, he chose to stop and help. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm traveling, I usually don't have built into my itinerary step number 3, save someone's life. I don't have that in my itinerary, my travel plans. If I'm going somewhere, most of the time I just want to get there when I'm traveling. Does that make sense? That's what I want to do. This Samaritan schedule might have been just as full as the priest and Levite, might have been just as full as of any of our schedules, yet he chose not to be driven by his personal busyness, but he chose to be driven by the compassion of God. And it was all over the Samaritan. The second thing he did is he paid the price, which was really a big deal. He bandaged this man. He bathed the wounds in expensive oil. He took him to the inn. He paid the bill. That's really something when you stop and think about it, because the Samaritan people were traditionally very, very poor culture. He didn't call 911. He didn't pass him off to someone else. He was willing to pay for this himself, right? All around us every week, there are men and women who are struggling. But get this, they are struggling just to be a survivor. There are people that look good, look just like you and I look, but they're just trying to survive. You know, and they get through the day and it's like, oh, dear God, I made it through another day. I didn't think I could. Or they wake up in the morning and say, I don't know if I can make it through this day. And they're just trying to survive. Look in verse 36. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? And the expert replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus said, go and do likewise. What was he saying? He was saying, be prepared to spend yourself, to exhaust yourself if need be in the lives of others. How many of you know that ministering to people is costly? You know, just planning a laundry event like we did yesterday, and did such a good job. We had a small crew, and they worked their tails off. Rick did such a good job in bringing all the stuff and putting it together. It was such a beautiful day. But we had to make plans to be there. We had to get up earlier to get everything ready and all that kind of stuff. And then the people that come in, it's not always very comfortable dealing with some people. So those kinds of things are costly. So when I minister to people, when I'm giving compassion out there to whoever it is, even you or you giving it to me, it costs us. For instance, it'll cost us our talent. Some of you are physically talented. You have intelligence. You're able to build and work and create things. You have gifts of encouragement. You have gifts of mercy, gifts of giving. And those gifts are not given accidentally to you. They're given by God purposefully. It costs you your talents. It costs you your treasure. Helping people, reaching people in the name of God always has a monetary cost, doesn't it? It'll cost you your time. You remember the priest and the Levite, maybe they were too busy, had all these other obligations. Do you know what God would say to them? He would say, make time. There are times when I say, well, I've got so much scheduled here. Guess what? If I schedule all my stuff and then try to cram God in there, guess what's going to happen? Guess who's not going to get any attention? God. And by that I mean ministering to people, because Jesus said, when you've done it unto the least of them, you've done it unto me. So the problem lies with my schedule. Maybe I need to go in and examine some things that can be set aside from time to time, at least for a season, and make myself more able to love someone with a smile, love someone with a pat on the shoulder, love someone with a, how are you doing today? How are you really doing today? And had the conversation, and I would have time to do it. I'm giving you a whole other sermon, but I think you know where I'm coming from. So it costs time. Ministering to people, being a neighbor, sounds all fun, and it's really sweet when you watch any of Mr. Rogers' episodes, which I'm watching them now. I'm addicted, but it sounds great and kind of glamorous, you know. Oh boy, we're going to minister to people, but it's not always convenient. Loving people with giving people compassion is not always convenient. I remember when God was teaching me this lesson several years ago about taking time, take a breath, just visit with a person for a minute. Take time, take a breath, just help this man, this woman. When I was learning that lesson, invariably, I would be late for a meeting. I'd be on my way to church, on my way to some appointment, and guess what? I would run into this man who was beaten and robbed. Every time. In the form of a person that just needed to talk. In the form of a person whose car wouldn't start or just had a flat tire right in front of me. How am I going to avoid this one? Some problem that needed immediate attention. And it was like God saying to me, okay, you've been talking the talk. Now, how about you walk the walk here? All right? Some of you are going to be cussing me this week after hearing what I just now said to you. Because you're going to be aware of some things that you weren't aware of previously, and you're going to go, gosh, I'm going to have to stop and fix that tire for that lady. I just know, you know what? You wait, and then you're going to cuss Pastor Michael. But before you do that, remember something. Because you are walking with God, there's no such thing as an interruption in your schedule. Say it one more time. Because you are walking with God, there's no such thing as an interruption in your schedule. It might be inconvenient, and you might feel inconvenient, but it's not an interruption. Look at it as a divine appointment. I need to say a word here. I need to just encourage that man that's crying over there. I need to that kind of thing. We'll talk more about that next week, by the way. We're going to talk about friends. What is a friend? How do we be a friend, and how do we receive friendship from other people? We'll do that next week. The third thing, the last thing, he was blessed. Because who do you think the happiest, most contented person is in the story? It's not the religious leaders. It could be that wounded man for sure because of the goodness that happened to him, but I think it was the Good Samaritan. Because of this, because there's no greater sense of joy and accomplishment in all the universe than loving and touching other people in the name of God and with the love of God. There's nothing like that. When you walk through that inconvenient situation and you're loving someone and encouraging someone and you walk away, you're walking with a spring in your step. You've got a breath of fresh air. It makes a difference, right? You feel it. You sense it in your own life. When you discover someone who's in need and hurting and troubled, and you are able to be the one that God uses to help that person, man, what you talking about? There is nothing like that. Nothing. So here's a question for you. Who needs you today? Because while you may have need of other people, there's still at least one person who has need of you. And I don't mean you have to do everything for someone like this Samaritan. I mean, even though he did a great deal for the man, he still didn't do everything. He didn't take him back to his home to recuperate. He didn't treat him like family the rest of his life, as far as we know. He didn't continue on with the relationship with the wounded man, at least as far as we know from Scripture. But I'll tell you what he did do. He did what he had the power to do. And he left it there. That's all we got to do. See, what happens is we'll look at someone else. You'll look at, well, yeah, it's easy for Pastor Mike to say that's what he's called to do. That's what Jesus says for him to do. And he can talk more or better than I can talk or whatever it is. But see, we can't compare ourselves to other people. I do what I can do. You do what you can do. And how many of you know if we do that, we're building a neighborhood? We're real neighbors. We like people that way. They understand this person likes me. This person maybe cares for me. So he didn't do everything for the man, but he did what he had the power to do. But guess what? That was enough. Because Jesus commended him, didn't he? He commended this Samaritan. And then Jesus told the hearers here, and he's telling us, now you go be like that Samaritan. And remember this too. Because Jesus said it on other occasions. When you've done it unto the least of them, you've done it unto him. Remember? So think about that. It's not just that person that carries the image of God, but it's Jesus. It's Jesus. There was a young boy who was walking through a park on his way home. And for some reason, he began to think about the lesson he had learned in Sunday school the week before. And the lesson was basically that. When you've done it unto the least of them, you've done it unto Jesus. And he was thinking about what that meant. And all of a sudden, he spotted an older woman sitting on a bench all alone. So he went over and sat down on the bench next to the lady. And she looked at him and smiled. And he thought, you know, she looks lonely. Maybe she's hungry. And he pulled a pack of M&Ms out of his pocket. And he opened the pack and took a couple in his hand, and he offered it to the lady, and she took them from him and gave him a smile. And he thought, I like that smile. And so when she finished eating them, he gave her some more, and she smiled even bigger. And then he gave her some more, and she smiled even bigger, and then he smiled. They were just mutually smiling, and finally all the M&Ms were gone. And so he just sat there for a few minutes just smiling back and forth with the lady. He loved her smile. As he left, he got 5 or 6 steps away, and he turned and ran back to the bench and put his arms around that lady and gave her a big hug. And she gave him her very best smile. And he went home. When he walked in the door, his mother said, wow, you're all smiles. What happened to you today? He said, oh, it was pretty cool. I sat on a park bench and ate M&Ms with Jesus. And she was older than I thought she would be. And he went into his room. And on the other side of town, an older woman walked into her little apartment that she shared with her sister. And her sister said, where have you been? And look at you all smiling. She said, greatest day of my life. She said, I sat on a park bench and I ate M&Ms with Jesus. And he's a lot younger than I thought he would be. I think it'd be a cool thing from time to time to just be mistaken for Jesus. And really, it should be kind of a consistent thing, I think, for Christian people, because we're filled with compassion. All we got to do is figure out a way to let it get released out of our hearts and into the hearts of those who need it. It can be a beautiful day in your neighborhood, that's for sure. It can be a beautiful day in all of our neighborhood for everyone. If we just have if we just allowed the compassion that's in us to flow out of us. Okay? All right. Is that a good lesson?
Perfect.
Help you?
Yeah.
Very good. All right. All right. Let's give the Lord a hand. Hey, those of you who are watching today on the internet, so glad you're here. We have a couple of other things we're going to do in-house, but next week we'll have some more clips. We're going to talk about friends and friendship. I think it'll be something that will be fascinating for you, and I hope that you'll tune back in and join us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for encouraging us. Thank you for your financial donations. God bless you. Hope your week is wonderful, and I hope your neighborhood is a real neighborhood. We'll see you then. Bye.